All right. All right, everyone. Oh, sorry. All right, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thanks, listeners. So I'm very excited today. Welcome to the Pop Health Show. This show is for anyone that has a super strong passion on the intersection of emerging technologies and shaping the future of humanity. And that's a pretty broad topic, but lots of good things are happening in the space. And I don't want to steal her thunder, but I'm very enthused and excited to have on the show today Smriti Jayaraman. And I know I hopefully I did that pronunciation correct.
Oh,
But
that was great.
Smriti,
That was great.
thanks for being here. Yeah, Smriti, you're an investor at Corazon Ventures. You have a broad background on consumer retail. You started off your career in media consulting, and you have some really important things that you've been doing throughout your career, and they just compound. But I don't want to steal your thunder. Welcome to the show, and thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Love what you guys are doing. So excited to be here.
Yeah, no, it's an exciting time, and these are very therapeutic conversations for our listeners, for myself personally. And it's just good to talk about technology, but it's all about you. And I'd love to hear about teleport us back to what led you to this, where you're at right now. I'd love to just hear about origin stories and your origin story. So yeah, I'd love to just listen.
Yeah, sure. It's a broad question, but I'll try to distill it. I think usually when I'm asked about where it all began, I talk about the irony of being an early stage investor who was born and raised in Silicon Valley, but here I am in Chicago as a VC. But if you look at the story with sort of a little more nuance, I think it makes sense. But I definitely, grew up born and raised in the Bay Area. Had immigrant parents who very much came to take part in the tech ecosystem, the booming, growing, burgeoning tech ecosystem in the late 80s, early 90s. And as a result, I had sort of a front row seat to what that world looked like. And in parallel, had my own interests and passions. I think I was very into drama and movies. So there was like a part of me that even today is very into cinema and entertainment and kind of the performing arts. There was a part of me that was very interested in politics and social impact. And I think the one sort of common thread between those interest areas and kind of viewing what was happening in tech at the time in the Valley was this idea of sort of anything is possible and an impact. And so there was, maybe a narrative around watching these innovators do things that had never been done before and having a huge impact on how we live our lives. And I sort of said, okay, I want to participate in that. And I did my undergrad in political science and business at Berkeley, and thought I was going to go sort of the pre-law public service route because that was sort of the most straightforward way to have an impact. And then when it came time to study for the LSAT, I kind of picked up the LSAT book and said, oh, this looks like a lot of reading and a lot of detail. And, there's this whole concept of management consulting that I keep, being told about in my business classes. And, they are very personable, very fun, very smart people that it felt good to be around, and said, okay, let me kind of kick the can down the road on deciding what I really want to do with my life. And decided to spend a couple of years in management consulting, really with the idea that I was leaving all the doors open, maybe building a little more of a practical skill set before I go decide what I wanted to be when I grew up. And it turns out that is a job I really enjoyed. And so spent more time in consulting than I thought I would. So 3 years before business school and a couple of years after business school. Probably, with sort of the same story in my head the entire time, which is we are solving really, really interesting problems at the most senior levels. And so this idea of like maximizing impact, even as someone relatively early and inexperienced in my career, was very exciting. It was intellectually stimulating. And I got to do it with people I really, really enjoyed, which, this is not a shameless plug for consulting because I'm no longer a consultant, but I do credit it as being sort of the best first job anyone can have, because you are constantly sort of pushed to think about new ideas, exposed to a variety of industries, problems, sectors, functions, And again, with I think very smart, challenging people who I also ended up enjoying as friends as well. And so a lot of my close friends are still sort of my classmates in consulting out of undergrad. And in business school, use that opportunity to kind of explore more of this idea of what I wanted to be when I grew up, and started to feel a little bit like consulting. While it checked a lot of boxes, in what I just described, did feel a little arm's length, and like that idea of impact, though, was big problems, big ideas, senior level, it wasn't mine. At the end of the day, our clients, brilliant clients, were making the decisions, and you were sort of like relinquishing control to them. And that combined with this idea that, there was this crazy, still growing, very exciting startup ecosystem, which certainly the buzz was around me when I was in the Bay Area, but then now in business school, the buzz was even more around me because you've got all these people, starting companies in business school, and venture capitalists speaking to us, and previous alumni that have, all the household name logos under their belt. And so I thought, maybe doing something in the early stage ecosystem was going to be interesting to me, but without knowing exactly what that was, and maybe with a little bit of, I don't want to say naive, but a unique belief that like I wanted to still do something I cared deeply about, not just be at a startup to be at a startup. Continued to kick the can down the road. I, spent some time for a few months at a startup out of business school, but then it ultimately went back to consulting. And finally, and there's, the whole personal story woven in here, which is my now husband, then boyfriend, at some point in between fiance. He's an economist. He was doing his PhD at the time, and we knew, he was going to ultimately land somewhere. And so I was able to tell myself that both waiting to figure out sort of what that startup leap is that I wanted to take, and waiting to see where he was going to end up would coincide. And they did here in beautiful Chicago. And so we moved here about 7 years ago. And it was, that was the moment where it was sort of like, okay, now I need to take the leap. It may not be perfect, but I'm itching for that feeling of the impact being my own, taking ownership, and of not feeling like I'm sort of arm's length from the work anymore. And met with a bunch of startups and loved what they were doing, and was looking for that one that was like, hey, look, I could wake up every day and just be so passionate about this problem that I'm ready to roll my sleeves up and do it. And in the process, ended up meeting with the investors of some of the startups, and loved, the work they were doing, and actually had spent my summer in business school in venture capital as well. It was actually Impact VC, which again, combining this idea of social impact and technology and innovation. But met with more traditional VCs here in Chicago, and it felt like the perfect stepping stone into an early stage startup to sort of sit in the buy side role, if you will, and look at multiple startups in multiple industries at multiple stages, help and support them, and then use that as a way to figure out, which one I wanted to jump into. And here I am, 6 years later, and haven't yet made that jump. And in the process, have fallen in love with the job we do as investors, primarily because I am so in awe of founders and what they do. And it's amazing. It's extremely impressive, and it's extremely daunting. And, when I meet founders who are so passionate, amazing executors, and have this like really, I hate using the word manifest, but like if anyone can manifest as an early stage founder, and knowing that that's the bar, and you have to have that ability to like really will these things into reality. That bar has almost kept me on the other side, and all I want to do now is support and enable the amazing folks who want to go that path, and that's what we do here at Corazon. And I been at a couple different firms prior to joining Corazon, but that's been the common theme. And then the last thing I'll say is, I think this podcast has a beautifully worded, and I don't know if that's like the party line, but I like the way you talk about the topics you cover here and the theme. And not only has that been, I think, a theme in my career, but has also been a theme of why I've continued to invest in the areas I invest in. Consistently been consumer facing and or retail enabling technologies as a focus. I describe it as enabling the modern consumer journey, which is really, what do people want their lives to look like, their experiences to be like, and how is that going to improve over time, and how is technology going to enable that, not to be incremental improvement, but true step function, transformational improvement. At Corazon, we sort of, we do a little bit of everything, but we tend to focus on consumer internet, so edtech, fintech, social apps. The second category is kind of tech-enabled consumer products. The third is marketplaces, both B2C and B2B. And then the fourth is retail enablement, both on the back end, kind of logistics and supply chain, and then on the front end when you think about retail experiences for consumers. So how you buy things, loyalty, rewards, marketing, etc. And all of that to me is exciting, one, because I've been doing it for a few years. So I like to think that I know a little bit about what I'm doing, though the world is changing fast. And the other reason is, it is so visceral in our day to day. And if, I had to describe to myself 5 years ago the way we live our lives today, even 5 years ago, I wouldn't have believed it. And it's exciting to meet people who have a passion around how we improve our lives, and to feel like we can play a small part in enabling, their visions.
I love it. I love it. I really appreciate, your background on a lot of the dimensions you mentioned, and it's exciting. You came from Silicon Valley, so you understood also, the value from, that startup energy perspective. The management consulting perspective really sets you up nicely for your career, and what you're doing now in venture capital brings that kind of poise and discipline, right? Where, obviously venture capitalists have so many different backgrounds, but I like that thread. It'd be interesting to see kind of maybe schools and middle schools start to expose people a little bit more to what management consulting is, and the areas of venture capital and things like that. So I'm fascinated to hear. I have a nephew just starting college too, so I'm going to share some of these perspectives with him. But tell me a little bit about these themes. So, right, impact, emerging technologies, consumption, ways of buying, e-commerce enablement, retail, tech. But what are some themes that have you excited lately, today? What's changing? We all know things are changing fast, but from your lens, what's changing fast? And in that change, what's exciting? Just love to hear more about that.
So much. I won't cover everything, but I think two or three things that are sort of top of mind now. I think one is, we talk about consumer internet businesses, and that's everything, again, from social apps to lifelong learning platforms to fintech solutions. And these have been areas that I think have seen a decent amount of innovation in the last 10 years, and have definitely seen some bubbles and some compression. But I think, what's happened in the process is, like, the average consumer has become more and more discerning, more and more reflective on what they want their lives to look like. Some of that is reflected in the creator economy and the gig economy, and the fact that people sort of own their destiny a little bit more, and what they want their careers to look like, or sort of their more non-traditional careers to look like. Some of that is reflected in the fact that areas like coaching and mindfulness and meditation have really taken off. And so I think for us, like, the way that, and for me in particular, I think the way that plays into how I think about consumer tech innovation, and what I get excited about, is this idea that there is no longer this distinction between, like, the mass consumer and what we used to call the prosumer, right? The prosumer was like your early adopter who maybe, was more upper middle class, is maybe more urban, had exposure and access to these technologies much earlier than sort of the mass market. And, a lot of people were, I think, over the last few years, innovating for that prosumer, and not realizing that, at some point there is a ceiling to how interesting a business gets if you're just kind of catering to a very, very small niche market. But what I think is happening, which is great for innovation in that space, is that, like I said, sort of there isn't that distinction anymore, and more of the, whatever you're calling the average consumer, but let's just call it sort of a larger cross-section of the ecosystem, is now interested in how they can improve their lives and investing in that. And it's not the same thing for everyone. For some, it's, hey, I want to improve my confidence, when I speak in a, in a meeting, right? And for others, it's, I want more exposure to the rest of the world and, cultural literacy. And for others, it's, I want to own my career and I want the right tools to be able to say, hey, I want to make, this much money in a month, but I don't want a 9-to-5 job. Like I can actually go do that and I can optimize that. So I think those types of tools will continue to be really interesting to us. We've made some investments recently in the ed tech space and the fintech space that really touch on those themes. And so I think that's one I'm super excited about. The second, which without getting into, AI in a huge way, of course, we're taking notice. We're not taking the approach that some other investors are, which is like, hey, look, we need to go pencils down on everything else and just focus on AI for the next 12 months because all the big AI businesses will be built in the next 12 months, which may be true, right? But that's not the approach that we are taking. As consumer and retail and marketplace investors, the approach we're taking is a little more to say, hey, look, we know AI is going to touch these spaces. We don't yet know like which base layer or even secondary layer or tertiary layer is going to ultimately win, whether it's going to be winner take all or not, whether everyone's going to be disrupted by more and more open source solutions. But if we instead take the perspective of, okay, what is the user experience that we are anchored on? What are sort of business models that make sense on their own, but then will be enhanced and enabled as AI becomes more pervasive? And how can we invest there? And I think there are 2 or 3 things that we get excited about. One is, again, being retail technology investors. The shopping experience has continued to transform almost, rapidly in the last several years. And some of that was pandemic influenced. Some of that was just how, the picks and shovels of e-commerce have transformed. But we think that there's still so much exciting innovation that can happen, right? And everything from, hey, I can take a picture of, this podcast right now and it'll tell me what you're wearing and I can shop it right away. And all of my, payment details are already in there. To, we talk a little bit about like recommendations are kind of the 1.0 because it's digesting all this data based on what I've already done. But coming back to this idea of like, human improvement, the future of shopping and the future of consumption, could it look more like someone telling me what I don't know I want, right? And it's not reflected in my historical transactions or my day-to-day behavior or what I talk about that my phone listens to, but in something else, right? In some other view of like where I want to get and a different point of arrival. So that's kind of the second sort of maybe theme, which is this idea of AI-driven retail and consumption experiences. You can call them shopping experiences, commerce experiences. And then the third, I think, is maybe this idea of, marketplaces and connectivity. We've made some social investments before. We, as I said, are very excited about marketplace businesses, about, how a single resource can drive exponential value, and marketplaces are sometimes the best ones, are able to enable like a more than one-to-one creation of value. And that's transforming too, right? And a lot of maybe, the obvious spaces have been turned into marketplaces in the last, decade or two, whether that's real estate or physical assets or skills. But what's the next set of things that can be, marketplace ready? Maybe that is, taking it a little bit further in terms of learning and education. Maybe that's taking it a little bit further in terms of more traditional industries that have just started to come online and actually can skip a couple steps that other industries have gone through. And, I, again, going back to my like social impact world and experience, have spent some time in developing countries. And when I spent a summer in business school in Impact BC, we were focused heavily on Asia and Africa. And, you look at some of those ecosystems and they have skipped, leapfrogged steps, right? They went straight from, they skipped the whole landline era in some communities, right? They went straight from no connectivity to mobile. And, can you start to see maybe versions of that play out even in developing economies, given AI and machine learning and some of the, and Web3 and some of the new technologies that we have access to? So, that one's maybe a little more nebulous, but I think as marketplace investors, we think about like, what are the leapfrog opportunities there?
No.
But yeah, beyond that, I mean, it's all exciting, interesting stuff, and what we look at changes every day, and there are big problems to be solved. And like I said, I think about it in terms of what our lives will look like in 5 years, and this sort of continuous improvement that I think the modern consumer is now invested in.
I love it. I love it. No, it's really exciting. I appreciate the way you explain how you guys as a VC are looking at how AI approaches the spaces that you're in, reducing friction, elevating value, right? And all about that consumer experience. And now, I guess tying a thread to impact, obviously when you started your career and you were in management consulting, impact felt like an industry that was a little bit more philanthropic, a little bit more corporate social responsibility in nature, a little nebulous. And now it's starting to get a little bit more concrete. Politics aside, there's these ESG scores now, and now you have all of these consumer experiences wanting certain new behaviors from their consumers, their employees. I guess maybe can you speak to a little bit on how you see all of these ideal consumer experiences getting AI enabled, getting better user experiences, reducing that friction? How does that relate to impact? How do you think of impact now? Is it accelerating? Is it changing? Is it correlating with these new technologies in any way? Just love to hear on how you think of that and the future of impact going forward and the intersection of consumer and impact.
Yeah, it's a loaded question, so I'll try to give a somewhat specific answer. But one is like you just look around, and the digital footprint of a lot of investors, whether it's venture capitalists or private equity or growth equity or even public equity investors. The dialogue around impact is definitely much more prevalent than it was before, right? And is all of that like legitimate? Who knows? But at the very least, there's an understanding on the buy side, and again, I use that term very, very broadly, that people care about seeing those words, right? And that those words resonate. And it is, financial impact is a type of impact, and like making returns for your investors is a type of impact. But that people, want to think you are doing something more than that. And there are very, different forms of that. And so I think just that understanding amongst the finance community has been interesting to watch. And then I think, for us, very tactically, at the firm I was previously, we actually were heavily focused on sustainability as one of our pillars. And that included both sort of climate and wellness. And found that, yes, there is so much consumer interest and there's so much sentiment, and all of the big corporations talk about it and care about it and have actually some, pretty commendable goals associated with it. But where the rubber meets the road, there's still a gap. And what I mean by that is, at the end of the day, a lot of Fortune 500 companies are still thinking more about their, next quarter's earnings than they're thinking about the goals they have to achieve in 3 years. And what I like about venture capital is it can, again, kind of help bridge that gap, right? It's sort of the tip of the spear to say, okay, look, we get that you have this, multi-billion-dollar behemoth, and you've got hundreds of thousands of stakeholders to respond to, and you've got your earnings call at the end of this quarter. And, you have to be able to like answer those questions before you can talk about, oh, we made all these investments in the interest of where we need to be in 10 years. And so I think the lens we take is like, what can early stage investors do to help accelerate some of that change and make it clearer to some of the larger, more legacy entities that there is an ROI associated with investing in these spaces. But also, that requires being practical, right? Like a big shift we've seen as e-commerce investors is, the rising tide that lifted all boats 4 years ago at sort of the pre-pandemic and then the onset of the pandemic, which made it feel like any business could be a direct-to-consumer business. Well, it turns out, that's not actually the steady state. And steady state is the unit economics of a lot of products just don't sustain being direct to consumer, and that's okay.
Right.
And they need to be in retail. But that also means that, if you are going to charge 30% more for something because it costs 50% more because you're making it with sustainable materials and your production process is all above board and no child labor and clean ingredients and all the things, that the economics need to actually work then for that innovation to make an impact. for that business to actually sustain. And so I think it's a little bit of like, we take the pragmatic approach with a lot of ambition around what we want impact to look like. And, venture capital it's a long-term play. Things take 7 to 10 plus years. I think they used to take, I forget the exact data, they used to take 5 to 8. Now they take 8 to 12, and I'm sure they'll take 12 to 15 in the future, right? And so we're patient, but we are, I think a big part of that is being pragmatic and acknowledging, where there's a lot of great dialogue around sustainability and impact, and then where there can be actual, real, sustainable economics, ROI, and ultimately sustainability for a startup that has those big ambitions.
Nice. Well, Smriti, this is great. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your perspective here on where the future is going and where consumer and impact is going. Your background, your things that you're passionate about. Congratulations, obviously, on, we didn't get to talk a lot about your portfolio investments, but obviously many different investments in all the different thematic areas of retail, e-commerce, enablement, consumer impact, even some Web3 investments you guys have made. But I'd love to have you back on, maybe like 6 months or 12 months from now, and just hear kind of what you're continuing to be up to, what you're investing in.
Sure, yeah. We can go deeper instead of sort of the, now you have the overview. So happy to, that sounds great.
Yeah. Well, my very last question is, if our listeners would like to get in touch with you or interact with you on social media, what would be a good way to do so if you'd like that to happen?
You can tweet me. Smriti is my Twitter, and you can also just email me, smriti@corazon.com. And always happy to hear from folks who are doing the great work, and again, so much respect for amazing founders. So happy to chat with whoever is interested.
Well, I really appreciate it. Thank you for peeling off time to do this. This was very rewarding and engaging for me, and ideally our listeners as well. And to our listeners out there, this is the Pop Health Show. This show is for anyone that has a super strong passion on the intersection of emerging technologies and impact. And Smriti, thank you so much again for doing this. This was great.
Thank you, Anthony. It was great to be here.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks.